Hey everybody, are you having a good show so far today? Yeah? Thank you for coming. This is gonna be a fun one. First of all, I'm gonna just read a couple things, and then we're gonna get started. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. I want to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors include the Greater Columbus Arts Council, the Ohio Arts Council, White Castle, and UBS. Introduce myself. I'm Dan Gearino. I'm a board member for CXC. So if you've been here in previous years, you've seen me probably. And our guests actually need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. But we have Jim Rugg. You may know him from such comics as Street Angel, Hulk Grand Design, Octobriana. How do I pronounce that?
Octobriana.
Okay. And The Plain Janes. And Ed Piskor. You know him from Hip Hop Family Tree, X-Men Grand Design, Red Room, WYSIWYG. Did I leave out any major works? Is that good?
That's fine.
That's a good summary.
That
Yeah.
works.
So you guys, one of the challenges with talking to you guys in a setting like this is you have a gajillion hours of you talking about, just stuff and talking about comics and it's like, what in the world could we possibly add to that body of work? And a lot of our audience has probably seen tons of that. I know that I have. So one of the things, just to start, because a lot of folks here are familiar with your work, I want to get an idea of what you consider to be kind of your formative work. Kind of the project you did where you were a baby cartoonist when you started it, and when that thing was done, you were like, yeah, we're cooking with gas. So I'm wondering, maybe Jim, you first.
Mine is Street Angel, for sure. And it's great to talk about that here in Columbus because Street Angel debuted in Columbus at Space. It was before CXC was an event here, but debuted as a mini comic. And I'd been doing mini comics for a couple of years at that point to not great results, nothing really caught on, but I was getting better as a cartoonist and kept making stuff. And brought out Street Angel at Space and sold out of it. And I could tell that was a difference. I had been doing a few shows a year, so I knew what my stuff sold, and that was atypical. And from there, I sent that to a publisher, SLG in California. They agreed to publish it, and I did 5 issues with them over about a year and a half in a collection. And that's probably, it led to Plain Janes. I went directly from Street Angel to Plain Janes, so I don't know if I ever made this leap that you're describing, but it was probably somewhere either during Street Angel or Plain Janes. That was a pretty busy, maybe 2-year stretch for me. Mm-hmm. And coming out of the Plain Janes, I think I had at least a lot of the tools that I use today.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Ed?
I would say it was WYSIWYG, and specifically, it was probably the first comic where I wasn't trying to approximate some other kind of comic. Growing up, and I think, Jimmy, maybe you can corroborate this also, man. When you get started, you're doing a lot of copying, and you're reading a lot also. So I remember, reading Love and Rockets 2, and it's like, oh, I want to make something like that. And then it's like reading Dark Knight Returns. Oh, I want to make a comic like that. But WYSIWYG was the comic that, I acknowledge that, I have a certain knowledge base of my own that maybe other cartoonists don't. And I should just take this time to explore this unique idea. That's my own personal vision. It's scary to do that sometimes because there's no empirical evidence on the racks to point to what an Ed Piskor comic looks like. But I think that's the first comic where I felt kind of comfortable doing my own thing.
Mm-hmm. There's these kind of breakthrough works, the things where you really kind of feel like you're now, I'm a cartoonist now, or, and are known to others. But for people with really long careers, they go through all these phases where they're doing cool, different stuff, and I guess I wonder, where do you feel you are right now? I mean, you guys talk so much about these great artists that went through so much change in their careers. Do you have enough kind of ability to step outside your own kind of daily experience and say, yeah, I'm wherever in your career? Like, what do you think, Jim?
It's really hard to evaluate your own work. You know, for one thing, we're closer to it than anybody here. Like, I could have a psychotic stalker fan out there and they don't see the work the way I do. And conversely, I can't see it the way any of you do. So that's a really tough question, and I hate to kind of punt on it.
That's okay.
But I have no idea. You know, like I recently finished up Hulk Grand Design. I'm not positive what my next work is going to, you know, the next thing that I commit a year or two to. So yeah, it's a not something I spend a lot of time thinking about in the terms you're describing. You know, for me, it's what am I excited to do next, and that could be a challenge. And I do look at projects when I'm done and think, what have I done here? Like, what's worked? What might I want to do again? Octobriana was a book, the world's first blacklight comic that I made, I don't know, a couple years ago. And I remember finishing that book. I crowdfunded that book, and at the end of that process, I thought, oh, okay, this clearly there are doors open, because this is one more new business way to make comics. And you know, that's something I think of, Ed, with WYSIWYG, was because we do a lot of independent work, even though we've both done work at Marvel. But that independent work is part of the creative, you know, like figuring out how you budget time, how you can budget cost of books and production and all that stuff. It does open the doors creatively, and that's a big chunk of it. And after I finished Octobriana, I remember looking around and being like, oh, I can make anything now, because this is one more avenue where I don't need someone's permission. I don't need to convince one person at, you know, some company that this weird idea will work. And so I can remember being conscious of like looking out and thinking, all right, this is something, you know, this is something new. It's the next level or whatever. And so I don't know where I am in terms of my career, who knows? But it does feel like, you know, it is a progression. And I do feel that from project to project, like, okay, I've done some stuff that I hadn't done before. So that's awesome. It's one more tool I've got. It's one more thing I can call on. You know, it is steps. Does feel like you're assembling this skill set and hopefully applying that and challenging yourself.
So feel free to punt it. But what do you think?
Thankfully, a lot of my earlier plans sort of worked out, and you know, I am of that mindset to do the 5-year plan kind of thing, and try to project forward and play a long game, you know. And a part of that early on, like after WYSIWYG with the hip hop comic, and certainly seeing that it was at least getting a lot of attention online. And it did do well in print, but the thought was, let me actually have some comics that are in the black at this point. You know, I'm getting old, and I would like to have something that works for me so that I can be a little bit more experimental over time and know that certain stuff is taken care of. And, you know, it's 9 books later, and they're all doing well. So I have a lot of freedom, you know, and I have freedom that, like, I wouldn't give anything up for like the freedom that I have. So it's really fun. I do know what my next stuff is going to be, and I could kind of take my time, you know, and it's sort of exactly as planned. So I'm super, super thankful for that. But I still, you know, I turned 40 this year, and I still have that. It's a game that cartoonists play when you realize, when you see what age Jack Kirby was when he created Fantastic Four. So I still have some years on that. So, you know, but it's getting closer. So at some point I have to make my masterpiece, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Well, I feel like, I mean, I guess because of course it's very difficult when it's your own kind of career you're looking at, but I feel like both of you guys, and you're kind of getting at it here, you're both right in the heart of your primes. As, you know, if you're pro athletes, you're on, you know, year 5, you know, where you're just, and I feel like the work that where I was seeing, Ed, your work discussed by completely different people than before was, of course, X-Men Grand Design. And that's something where, speaking as someone who read a lot of those original comics, when I was just reading that, it was kind of a mind-blowing thing. It was like, but one of the questions I asked was, how the hell did this get made? You know, because it's like I don't think I'm enough, me as a one buyer is not enough to support, but it seems like it was very well received. What's kind of the origin story for that book?
The hip hop comics did really, really well in the traditional book market and in record shops and stuff like that. I did a direct market version of, a floppy version of Hip Hop Family Tree, and it did whatever it did. But the bulk of my business with Hip Hop Family Tree was not the traditional direct market comic shops. And I knew I had ideas for something as far out as Red Room that I wanted to explore. And doing the X-Men book to me was like my introduction to the direct market shops, to those retailers. Hey, what's up? My name's Ed Piskor. I'm doing this X-Men book, and I want to make sure it sells a lot for you, so that when I do, this Red Room thing, which I wanted to come out in floppies, and Fantagraphics has kind of pushed away from doing a lot of periodicals. Love and Rockets comes out, and that's a machine. It does what it does. But I need to make this work for myself. If I want to embark on a career making comics, I got to make sure this stuff sells, or else it's Burger King for me in terms of a career, So that was part of that 5-year plan kind of thing. Like, let me do this X-Men thing, put myself in front of comic shops, traditional ass, use the previews, buyer's guide thing, comic shops. And, it turned out well. Brought my homies along to do other grand designs, which was part of the plan. I wanted 2 personal goals with that series was to get Marvel to quit being so constipated with format. Like, I have a bunch of big books that sell just fine. Let's publish this like a big book. And then I like the idea of an actual cartoonist making a Marvel comic. Let's see what that looks like when it's not a jerk off, like those Strange Tales or whatever, where it's like you get the best independent comics talent to do something and you do a 3-page nonsense thing. Let's have some earnest cartooning by a single person and see what that looks like from Marvel. So then Tom did his piece, Jimmy's doing his piece. But it was my effort to just say what's up to the direct market. And then when Red Room came out, they supported it incredibly. Red Room did better than the X-Men book in the direct market.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I would have thought that X-Men book would just be touching this very specific kind of this kind of nostalgia nerve plus something else, something better. There's obviously tons of nostalgia for the eras of X-Men that you cover, but you're kind of providing something new, where I would have thought that would have done just better than, exceptionally well.
What I also bring to the table is a little bit of hustle. I will sell my stuff. I'm unapologetic about that, and part of having the channel, every single day, we're very giving with what we present a lot of stuff, but I'm going to tell you about my books every video, and that certainly helps. So, I was going to sell. I knew I was going to sell some comics. I even invested in a publicist to take it around and get articles written about it and stuff. And your average Marvel dude is not doing that. So.
Well, and thanks for promoting the show on the channel.
Every day.
Yeah, it's been great. I do a little yes every time I would see that. So I need to say the bias that I have coming into this panel is obviously Hulk Grand Design just came out, and I was not a huge X-Men fan. I read that stuff, but the Hulk stuff that you're referencing in that is just this just was. Again, I feel like it was maybe marketed just to me, but I just
it's true, Dan.
Yeah.
This is my master plan.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're the age of the people going to the comic shop now,
Yeah,
so it
yeah.
might as well be. You know what I mean?
So I adore that book, partly because I loved the original comics, even though going back on Marvel Unlimited, sometimes some of them weren't as good as I remember. But and I'm just curious. Okay, so you're doing what was now the 3rd Grand Design project. Okay, so you got these 2 cool projects right before you. You got all this amazing and weird source material. How do you? What kind of challenge was that?
Well, first, huge pressure, huge. You know what? I don't know. I had seen guys do it that I'm close to. I watched both of these, Tom and Ed, do their grand designs, so I kind of saw their process. And it was really reading. It's a lot of I read the first 500 issues of the Hulk, 3 or 4 times, once just straight through. I would joke and say it was like brain damaging, like I need to read something else now to kind of undo that. One of the weird things that happened, though, of course, and we were all part of this, is the lockdown. And one of the things that comes through in that book, I think, is just the loneliness of Vanner, the main character, kind of the focal point, just completely alienated from really the human race because of the Hulk, however you want to think about the Hulk as part of him. And in hindsight, like once I finished the book, not something I thought about while doing it, but when we finished that book and I was kind of like, closing the chapter on it, putting the actual collection together with a little bit of some notes and things, I realized like that sense of loneliness was me locked in a room for 1.5 years with 500 Hulk comics, just going through this kind of strange material. I like the strange material. I like the weirdness of it. So it was very fun from that point of view. But the circumstances kind of lent themselves to that book, I think, in a positive way. So some of that's not my planning, obviously, but I think you work with what you have, and those were my circumstances. So that worked out, pretty well. In terms of like, I'm joking about the pressure part because like one of the nice things with Tom and Ed and my work, I think, is that we're pretty different. Despite growing up kind of in the same area and being friends for 20 years, I feel like everybody can identify our styles distinctly from one another. And so, it wasn't too much of a challenge on that part, to bring something different. And the Hulk's a very different character. For one thing, he's a loner compared to 2 team books. And I always would say the Hulk's a monster, where like all the superheroes are kind of a certain type. And the Hulk is not an anti-hero and he's not a superhero, he's a monster. So I had a unique character to work with in that too. And I think that, made my job probably much easier. If I'd have been doing Avengers, it might be much tougher to try to make a book that was different than X-Men and Fantastic Four Grand Design. But in my case, it was a monster book, and when I'm 6 years old, my favorite thing on earth are monsters, So getting to do the Hulk, like, it's probably the one character I have some nostalgia for, because I don't really start reading comics until I'm about 11 or so, 10 or 11, 12. And at that point, the very first comic book I bought, by the time I got home, I decided that's it, I want to be a comic book artist. And from that point on, I bought comics based on what can I learn from this, who is the artist, and that was it. It was never like, what's going to happen to Peter Parker? Like, just didn't care about that part. I cared about the artist and how these books were made. But the Hulk, I liked when I was a kid. When I was 6 years old, I had a cereal bowl that was the Hulk, and I would read about his 1,000 pounds of unfettered fury every single morning before first grade. That's the one character I have some of those feelings for. So it was very enjoyable to go through that process of digging into that character, quite frankly, reading many Hulk comics that I had not read before. And it was an interesting reading experience. You talk about reading some of these comics on Marvel Unlimited. I would read like 20 of those Hulks a night whenever they were written for like 6 and 7 year olds. It's a strange experience.
Well, yeah, it's like reading them straight through on Marvel Unlimited. When you know a good run is coming up, you're just wanting to like mentally tell the people back then, just hang on, guys. This is rough, but it's. So I wonder, with both of you guys spent so much time with back issues, with doing research for both of those grand design projects. Like, so Ed, is there? Well, first of all, were you an X-Men fan growing up? Like, was this right in your wheelhouse in terms of what you and kind of what did you do you see the material differently, or after kind of living with these characters for all this time, kind of how did it change the way you think about them?
I mean, I certainly grew up with X-Men, absolutely. Like the Mark Silvestri era created a situation where that book was easy to find and shop and save. Before that, it was maybe a little dicey, and then Jim Lee comes along, and that is what lots of kids in school actually were talking about. Like I'm a product of the speculator boom of the 90s, which means that I don't have the scar tissue of the older fans who were treated like dimwits for like in comics. Like football players were grabbing comics. They weren't reading them. They were going to put themselves through college with those X-Men ones, you know what I mean, that they were hoarding. So I was absolutely reading the stuff as it was coming out. I'm maybe 10 years old when that animated series comes out. Get the Genesis video game, all the figures. So I was a mark for that stuff, absolutely. And then when I'm really getting serious as a reader of comics, I'm getting my hands on, older issues, and then you discover like the John Byrne stuff. And for a kid, that's primo superhero comics. Doing the project, it was like, doing a couple reads through with the Chris Claremont stuff and seeing that it's pretty clear this guy's making this stuff up month after month. Mm-hmm. There's no grand plan here, really. And the whole genesis of the grand design thing was me running my mouth. I drew this image with the X-Men, like the 60s team, the 70s team, 80s team, 90s team. Mm-hmm. And I tweeted it out and said, Marvel should just let me do whatever kind of X-Men comic I feel like making. And I just put that out there. Axel Alonso hits me up within an hour. I have nothing. Like, so he called me on a bluff. And with that quick, affirmation, I just talked to him. I was like, listen, man, I know how to make the first 300 issues of X-Men seem like it was made to like it was planned like that from the very beginning. I was bullshitting him. I read it all, I have all the essentials at this point, and gave it all a fresh read. And I'm like, ooh, there's a lot of heavy lifting that's gonna be required to make this thing work in any way, shape, or form. And then when I started to indulge and started to plot things out, I'm like, you know what, this is a Fletcher Hanks comic. Take all the soap opera out of it, man. One panel, Professor X is here, and then the next panel, he turns into the Brood. Yep. And Wolverine's about to claw him, and the alien is saying, please don't hurt me. Like, it's the weirdest, most far out comic ever. But when I gave it those, second rereadings, it's like, okay, I'm done. Like I'm done, no more. Mm-hmm. But now that we have this channel, I'm like, I might have to go through this Claremont run and do some vids, like on the whole run over time, man. So I think I will revisit it, but. I'm tapped out when it comes to doing work for hire Marvel Comics or whatever.
Yeah. So Jim, what was so you in rereading all those Hulk books? Like, what was it that and kind of who was your first Hulk artist? What was the era that?
That's a good question.
It was Joe Fixit, and so the artist was. I'm blanking now.
Oh, it's Jeff Purvis.
Jeff Purvis, yes. I'm so sorry, Jeff. It's
one of the most underrated Hulk artists.
He's
a
very
supernova
underrated.
Creator. He just showed up for a little bit.
I think that's all he really did was that run, and it's great to read it all because he went from, I think, a pretty young artist to like really good in 20 issues or something. Not a big run.
It's less than that.
Yeah, it's short, but it's really solid. I love that Hulk. That was the Hulk I fell in love with. It's my favorite storyline of the Hulk is the Joe Fixit Gray Hulk. Purvis's art amazing, and that was one of the books that got me to buy a comic because I would always just kind of look at them on the spinner rack. My parents hated comics, I would have been in that comic readers were dimwits. I'm a few years older than Ed, so they weren't cool, and not only were they not cool, like my art teachers hated comics, my parents hated comics, my grandmother hated comics. I have an aunt that would tell stories about my grandmother finding her Warlord comics and destroying them. So we were like living in the late 50s, where I'm growing up. But I would see the Hulk in a suit on the cover, and finally I was like, I have to know what's going on here. He's gray and he's wearing a suit. This isn't the Hulk. And I bought one of those, and that was like my entry into, really buying and consuming comics. That's the comic that I bought, and by the time I'm home, I'm ready to be drawing them. So that's one that I have like a real connection to because literally that's what pulled me into the world of comics.
Getting those X-Men comics was like a jigsaw puzzle,
Yes.
in that Silvestri run, because there's clearly these relationships and you just go in cold. Mm-hmm. What the hell, man? You have no idea what's going on. There's like some A story that's kind of happening, but you only get a couple of pages of that. You're juggling 15 to 20 different characters in 22 pages, so you might only get 3 panels of this character, and you have no idea how any of this works. You have to get the next issue to just expand a little bit upon what you read the month before and hope to retain that information. The cool thing was, as a kid, it's like I have my 2 stacks of comic books, so I would just
what
read
adds
them
to the
every
fun
weekend.
of it, yeah.
Yeah. I would always describe it as it's almost like looking out a window where like there's a world out there and I can see a little bit here. And then I can go to that window and see a little bit more. And that's what those, like, you'd get an extra issue. X-Men was that way, but any of these comics were that way at the time. You know, they were the long-running series. So if I got sucked into one issue of Hulk or X-Men or any of them, and I wanted more, it was like you could go backwards if you were lucky, you know, and they would still sit on the newsstands where I was getting comics. So, like, I remember buying X-Men and then getting a couple of back issues of X-Men off of my newsstand just because they were lazy and didn't pull them off. But it was that experience, and it's what drew me into buying that first Hulk book. But to answer your question on artists, like, that's a big part of Hulk Grand Design for me, as opposed to, say, a Claremont telling a big soap opera story. The Hulk was much more all these different weird interpretations where it's like he's just getting irradiated constantly. So every time a new artist showed up, it was almost like a new Hulk. And I got Marvel Age. I'd buy everything I could find once I got in. And I bought a Marvel Age, and they would always have like the many faces of the Hulk would be like a one-page thing, and it would have like 15 different artist versions. It would have the artist name at the bottom and a key. So again, I'm chasing artists, and I'm trying to understand this. And it's like, that one looks cool. That's Jack Kirby. That one looks cool. It's Todd McFarlane. And so, like, there are these legendary artists that I would track down a lot of those back issues of the McFarlanes. Del Keown was a big one of my favorites when I was a kid. Sam Keith's first issue that I ever saw him was a fill-in of the Hulk, and it just like changed my brain, you know, like there was stuff he did in that one issue that I had never seen before. So Hulk has a pretty good history of great artists and artists that would really bring different stuff to that character visually.
So I must be 5 to 10 years older than you guys, and so when I think of those two eras you're talking about, I think the Silvestri era, oh man, you were just a few years after. That was the best stuff was right before that, you know. And then the Joe Fixed era is great, but then I mean one of my first comics worn out to the point you can't even read it anymore was some of those like Sal Buscema, almost getting into the issue 300 Battle Royale, like that stuff, and it's like. It's so funny, the kind of subjectivity of comics fans where you kind of think the best era was the era when you were reading it, when you were a certain age.
I think Sal Buscema is the best of the Green Hulk artists.
Yeah.
I thought it was, before I reread everything, you know, I wasn't sure where I was going to land on that. And Sal Buscema was like a revelation to me going through that stuff. Like he would draw him and it's almost like he's triangle shaped, which created such a powerful version where like somehow he's wider at his feet. Very hard thing to draw. A lot of artists don't pull that off, but it made for a great monster.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like lately, your podcast, which I don't, it may have started out as this, I assume it didn't instantaneously become a big thing. I feel like you guys seem to be dropping episodes every 5 minutes. When there's like a cool artist that I find from 20 years ago, and I'm like, and I Google them, I'll find an entire episode where you're talking about them. You know, it's like the body of work you've assembled. And I guess I just kind of wonder, I mean, do you guys think of yourselves, I mean, are you podcasters / cartoonists? Are you cartoonists and then ... and yeah, we also do a podcast? Because it seems like this podcast has just gotten so big and so good.
I never think about that label, but I mean, it makes sense. We do, you know, it's at least daily, if not multiple times a day.
Yeah, we joke about that, man. Dude, I think we're YouTubers, man.
But we're also comic fans, and so much of comics history exists because of fandom. So I'm thrilled if we can talk about any artist and sort of continue that, because I think there are tons of great artists in comics history that have not gotten their due. Or don't have a record online for somebody to Google and find. And so I'm thrilled if we're contributing to that. And we're both conscious of fandom in comics history in that way. So I'm thrilled if I'm adding to that.
We've been digging for comics our whole lives practically, and just amassed these ridiculous collections. You know, real estate is cheap in Pittsburgh, man. So you could keep those long boxes, man. And we would do these long drives to cons and just talk about, like, I have a lot of stuff and, you know, I want to share it somehow. The idea before was like maybe Tumblr, like Power Comics, you know, show the cover and do a little blurb or something. But hanging out and chatting about this stuff is cool, because we would kind of do that. We used to hang out every Wednesday for a lot of years in the aughts when we were all just getting started. And get your weekly comics and talk them. And we've been traveling to conventions together for 20 years. And it would always happen this way down at Heroes Con or something. We're sitting around, Tom will be with us also a lot of time. And we would just start rapping about comics, just riffing. And like little crowds will just start coming around because we're cracking each other up. Tom's cracking us up. And it just is like attracting more nerd energy. And then we'd be the center of attention in this little ball, like of just talking comics, and then other people would chime in. So it's like we already have practice before we even did our first episode. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think about the label stuff either, but, I think I spent 6 days drawing comics and then 1 day doing YouTube stuff. So the Cartoonist supersedes podcast, YouTube, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, the body of work with the podcast is so much that I think, except for, the people who've been watching since the very beginning, it's like, I certainly can't say I've seen every single one, but. Crossroads Columbus will be ending in 30 minutes. Yep. But one of the recurring themes is this, the way you guys discuss some of the 90s stuff that gets criticized a lot by others. This way, kind of talking about artists like Rob Liefeld, talking about like Todd McFarlane, and just taking a look at their work and really just kind of looking at what's on the page. Is this the conversations you were having before offline? And do you find, that's kind of, it's not unusual to hear people talk about how both of those guys are, not, their work gets criticized a lot.
I loved in the Michel Fiffe shoot interview when he said the phrase, like borrowed opinions or something like that in regards to a lot of the chatter online. Mm-hmm. And when the first, comment is about feet or anatomy, like I just laugh at that. It's like, let's put some tracing paper over top of Jack Kirby. If we're going to have that conversation, then like, what are you talking about here?
There's a weird magic in comics. Like you mentioned Fletcher Hanks a little bit ago. If anybody is unfamiliar with Fletcher Hanks, see our episode on Fletcher Hanks. But he was a golden age cartoonist, and he drew characters that weren't anatomically correct and perspective wasn't right. But it had this unique flair and voice. And that's the beauty of comics. So the people that want to criticize Rob Liefeld for bad anatomy, good thing he's not a doctor. That's the nice thing is we don't have to worry about that. In some ways that has no bearing on whether the comic's any good or not. And by the way, like I don't want to endorse Rob Liefeld comics as being great comics because they have their place, and that's not exactly what I'm saying. But being critical of his anatomy has nothing to do with whether a comic works or not. And in fact, a lot of the comics where you could say like everything's drawn perfectly, boring. Yep. Really boring. And there's a genre of artists in comics that are doing a lot of reference, heavily referenced. So great, it's super accurate. I am not interested in those comics. I can look out the window and see that for myself, or take pictures on my phone and see that, or Google image search and see it. I want the oddness. I want the weirdness. My favorite part of comics, without a doubt, is that it can be the work of one person. It can come from their brain through words and pictures into my brain. And so I want the peculiar parts and qualities and weirdness and stuff. And it's okay if that comic doesn't work for you, by the way. I don't need anyone else to feel the same way, but that's part of the reason that I like these weird comics. One thing about a Rob Liefeld comics, they're weird, they're strange. They're not that different than Hulk.
Yeah, I think of him as a Fletcher Hanks in a way.
It's outsider art, and I think you could say the same thing about Jack Kirby in a lot of ways. Like that dude figured out ways to draw that were uniquely Jack Kirby, and you know what? That's what I love about Jack Kirby comics is that they're Jack Kirby. Specifically,
when we talk about McFarlane or Liefeld, there is an inspirational quality to their work for me as I was growing up, like in my formative years, just knowing that I wanted to grow up to draw comics. At the same time, I was picking those things up off the spinner rack. They had reprints of the Tales from the Crypt. The HBO show was on, and Russ Cochran was able to get newsstand distribution for EC Comics, and I would get those too. And I was in that phase of copying art. And you cannot successfully copy a Wally Wood science fiction face that's double lit and all the bells and whistles that guy was able to draw, it made me feel like hopeless. Like there's no way I'm ever going to be able to draw comics when I grow up. I might have to cash it in. But then when I see that the dude on the Levi's commercial, like I get his comics, and I could kind of like, that's very attainable. I'm going to be able to get there one day, no doubt. You know, same with McFarlane and everything. So it holds that spirit for me, and that's, you know, I mean, they were very, very popular comics for a reason. I wasn't a part of any fandom. It took me 21 years to have somebody to talk about comics with. Mm-hmm. And I was picking that stuff up cold. You know, nobody told me to pick it up. I'm like, wow, this looks not boring. You know, that was the era of the house style when there was a lot of like ersatz, John Buscema looking guys. Mm-hmm. And just I was gravitating to the weird stuff that just didn't look like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's also like, we want to eat, you know, we want to have a roof over our heads. Those guys sold a lot of comics, and that can't be discounted. Even if you look at that stuff and say it's not high art or whatever, that's fine. But if you look at comics history, you've got to acknowledge those guys, because like they did stuff that nobody else had done. And not just in cells, they then put their money where their mouth was and started Image Comics, completely changing everything, you know, for us. I would always say, like, my dream when I was, 12 or something was I wanted to grow up and draw Wolverine and Hulk. Whenever they find Image Comics, then my dream is I want to create my own characters and grow up and draw my own books. And, that counts for a lot in my world. So if your art's maybe okay, you get a couple extra points for that. Mm-hmm.
So I have one more thing, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm curious, with you guys are able to, you just have just the sheer number of hours of the YouTube show. I just wonder, are you just coming in, turning the camera on, or is there a ton of prep? Or like, what's the behind the scenes? Are you trading messages via email to decide what the show's going to be, or what's that all look like?
We email, like, here's some books for this coming week. Usually that'll show up, like we record on Thursdays, so maybe Saturday, Sunday, we pull some books and basically email and get together a list, and then we try to, you got to read those before the following recording session. But we also talk, like we talked a lot on the way here. We'll talk a lot on the way home. We'll probably talk tonight at dinner. And the talk
we were
comes
being
up
made
with,
fun of a lot. They're like, you guys are sick of talking to each other.
That's right. But it's pretty organic in that way. The level of prep depends. I've gone into shows with 4 pages of single-spaced notes. I go into shows with no notes. So it really depends on the work and where we're coming from and the nature of it. Whenever we're like interviewing people, you want to be prepared. Like, we've talked to some of my heroes, you know what I mean? Like, you want to do as much prep as you can. I remember Gary Groth telling us that in regards to how he would prep for interviews. You do as much as you can, depending on the timing and the circumstances. Sometimes these things happen kind of quickly, and you may not have as much time as you want to prep. But as Ed says, you also want to spend 6 days a week, or at least have those 6 days to spend however you want. YouTube is a small part of the business. It's not the full-time piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So each week, 7 videos will switch up every week. One guy will edit 4 videos, the other guy will do 3, and switch off the following week. It kind of evens out, because the guy doing the 3 videos that week is in charge of like the one longer one. So it's all about the same amount of time, and that's very helpful to be able to put out this volume and have someone to rely on with the work. We recently started live streaming the full recording session, and it happens in one clip, about maybe 5-6 hours, and then we go off and do our thing. It is funny to fast forward to the end a little bit, because there is a shell shock that I see on our faces and stuff. And then you can look at the corresponding chat room, and there'll be guys like, man, I needed to eat 2 Snickers while watching this one, and because we're not eating and drinking. It's full comic stuff.
Wow. Okay, guys. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, right here in the first row.
What other hobbies do you have besides comics?
So, and I'm going to repeat the questions for the recording. So, I was asking, what other hobbies do you have besides comics?
I don't have one hobby. I live this stuff. They're like, comics to me is a culture, and it's the culture I live in. The YouTube is a great expression of that culture, stuff that's already going on in my head. So I live, eat, breathe this. We go upstairs. There's a lot of people behind a lot of tables selling a lot of comics, and I went to the Kubert School to try to learn how to do this, and I was put in a house. Student housing was the mansion, and there were 30 people who wanted that job. Finite amount of opportunities at that time, certainly in 2000. So it's just like I have to do more than everybody. So I'm fully devoted, completely invested.
I like to cook, although I wouldn't call it a hobby exactly. It's mostly my way of like unwinding at the end of the day at the drawing table. So that's kind of enjoyable. It's in a different room. It's on my feet. I like exercising, but I don't do it enough, like running, and I've done some running comics, and I may do more running comics. A lot of my hobbies are like day off is go digging in comic back issues. So maybe reading comics would be the hobby.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, you're right there.
I have a question. I see Jim Rugg doing a lot of alternative covers to Ed's Red Room series. Would you guys ever collaborate on a book, like Jim doing the line art and Ed coloring his book, or you, vice versa?
So the question was, would Jim and Ed collaborate on a book?
Never say never. It's not on the schedule, but I have huge respect for Ed as a cartoonist, so I've collaborated with other people, so it's possible, but I don't know that we've ever even talked about it.
Yeah, we're pretty, singular in our approaches and stuff, and I think that trend will continue. But I consider this is our collaboration. Cartoonist Kayfabe is our collaboration. I've done collaborative work in the young part of my career, and none of that was ever looked at in any regard whatsoever. And the second I started doing things on my own, I started getting nominated for Eisner Awards, started selling out print runs, and getting to get flown to other countries. So I'm like, I'll just do it myself.
And again, I think that is a real strength in comics. Like the more we've been doing this channel, and the more that we've read and kind of talked about, the more convinced I am that like the comics that are done with a team, and no disrespect, a lot of great comics have been done that way, but they're almost a different art form than the comics that are done by one person, in my opinion. It's a really different process.
All right. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of you guys' success, not only from your talent and hard work, but from your business savvy. Do you have any resources that either of you would recommend as far as understanding the business of comic?
So the question was complimenting their business savvy and just asking if they have any recommendations about kind of understanding the business side of comics.
We have the benefits of comic book history in a big way, and that was sort of my textbook and template for things. But I don't know any cartoonist that didn't make bad decisions a little bit early in their practice, sign bad deals, get weird royalties because maybe you don't know so many people to talk to and correspond with and chat with. I think that you have a lot of advantage now that just didn't exist back in the day before social media, where you can reach out to people and maybe even just float like little questions about an offer that you might have had or something like that to see if like that's equitable. But it just seems like there's a pain period that is the make or break. A lot of people get smarter and they go off into animation or something, but there are stubborn people who will realize like, okay, I will not do that deal ever again. You got to have maybe a round, two or three of those rounds, and then you shore up the seams a little bit. But there's a pain period, and I don't know anybody. I have no peers who got where they are painlessly.
Yeah, I'd say if you are going to school minor in business, and I actually think that's good advice for any field that you're majoring in. I mean, in a capitalist country, business is sort of it's the language. So I would recommend that if you ever want to do anything that you own yourself. be extremely protective of those rights, you know, in terms of the comics and the art and the writing and whatever you create, like you own it until you allow somebody to take it. You know, there are a million resources. As Ed said, there are some advantages now, you know, like there are trillions of hours of people giving business advice on YouTube and tutorials. Go to an airport bookstore and see the section on self-help. There's no shortage of information, but you really do have to kind of live it and see what applies to you and what those questions are, and ask questions, you know, ask a million questions. When you see somebody that is doing what you want to do, follow them around and see how they do it. One of the great things of having, you know, Ed in my life is now suddenly you connect yourself to people that are doing what you want to do or want to go where you want to go, because it's a lot easier if those are the people that you're around. So you find other people that are making comics and you share resources and you talk shop and you ask a million questions. And if you can't find answers, then you go out and ask them with everybody that you can get to. Like we used to do shows, we would talk about, you drive to the Heroes show, it's 8 hours in the car together where we're just talking comics, and then we go off for 3 days and basically gather as much information as we can from everybody else at that show, get in the car and come back and share that information. So we've got 8 more hours of conversation, but it's a lot of just gathering information. As Ed said, there's a long history in comics. Like you can see where mistakes were made and where victories were earned. So that information's out there, but you got to dig for it, and you're gonna make mistakes.
And that's the thing too, is that unconscious incompetence. Like you don't know what you don't know. So you make your comic and then do your best, and then you're gonna learn some things. It's very rare that a first comic is gonna put you in a position where you're all good. You know, a preview of future Kayfabe episode that we shot here, we looked at Thorn, the Jeff Smith collection of his college strips that were in a daily paper here at the Lantern in 1982, put the book out in 1983. And one of the things we brought up in the course of the conversation is like, you know, if this was a first comic, you know, the company first, like the right, or Comico, like the rights might have been tied up for years. It's possible that every book Jeff Smith sells, like some Comico dude has to get a piece of it or something like that. Like he could have, first off, there was like a 10-year period between that book and what is Bone. And I don't know about you, but like we all thought of Bone as like this like out of nowhere hit. And it's like, no, the dude worked on it for a decade at the very least.
Probably went out and learned the business part, you know, in other industries and animation and things like that. So Ed's best piece of advice there, though, is make comics. You know, make those comics. Mistakes will happen no matter what. Like, there'll never be that moment when it's like, I've got the knowledge I need, now I'm ready to make the comic. Make the comic now. Keep making the comic. Make the next one after you finish it. And make those mistakes and grow in terms of the business side while you're going. Like, I say that to everybody that asks this, because it's like, the day the book is released is not when an audience forms. Build that audience while you're building the book. You know, because it is a long, this is a marathon. Like I don't know any sprinters in comics.
I remember when MySpace was new, Coop, the artist Coop, put up a redacted back and forth between somebody who like didn't pay him updated royalties or something. And I was doing my own toil at that time and going through a lot of stuff and having to chase every dollar that like I was promised in contracts and things. And I remember that's when I started corresponding with him. I was like, Coop, you're Coop. Every girl I know has a tattoo. Every single one, because it was the era. And I'm like, you too? You have to chase your money too, man? He was like, yep, it never ends. So.
Asking that question is a good start.
Yeah, right here.
I just had a question for Ed. You mentioned the Silvestri era of X-Men. Is that your favorite era, what you consider the best, or is there another era that you like better?
So the question was, does Ed consider the Silvestri era of the X-Men to be his favorite?
Probably that John Byrne stuff. Yeah. Terry Austin, hard to beat.
All right, and we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yeah, you in the back.
Jim did the Octobriana through Kickstarter. What is your guys' opinion on crowdfunding moving forward? Like it, hate it, any opinion?
So the question is, what do Jim and Ed think of crowdfunding?
I love it. I recognize that it's it's going to vary how successful it is from project to project. But in terms of giving creators or artists or entrepreneurs one more avenue, one less gatekeeper, one more option, I'm all in favor of it. How you use it is going to vary, and certainly many people maybe don't use it well, but it's incredible the tools that we have. You know, like I think about the black and white comics that, like, when I decided I wanted to make my own comics, that's what you had, and I would look at those people, and it was very limited. Jeff Smith included, you know, had to go through Diamond because that was the only option. It's just one more tool, you know, and it took me 10 years to do a Kickstarter. I didn't have a project that fit. But whenever I finally had the opportunity, I viewed it as just, this is one more tool. It's the same way I look at digital coloring, iPads, you know, these are just tools. It's the same as paint tubes, you know, hundreds of years ago during Impressionism or something. It's just a tool, and I think it's a good one, and I think it gives us more options. You know, you think about it as a business, it's one more thing to consider when you're putting together that plan.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I think it's an inevitable thing that we're all probably going to have some stuff go through that at one point or another as a maker, and probably that might be the only way for a lot of us. And so, like, my strategy of late is like use the existing mechanism that we have for comics with the publishers that we have and the distribution that we have. And try to build the biggest audience possible, because when you're doing crowdfunding, you know, it's that tree that falls in the forest. Like, the people who hear it are the people who know you. You know, maybe you get some retweets or something like that, but your base supporters are the people in the audience that you've, accumulated over time. So my strategy right now is to just keep, you know, putting stuff out to just build a bigger base, because it's going to be a small percentage of those people that will, put their credit card into another platform or however that works to support that kind of project. But it's also a thing of, like, you know, if you don't publish a certain amount of books, it actually is better to just self-publish it. You know, like, my cutoff is like 10,000. Like, maybe I don't want to stuff 10,000 envelopes. And at that point, the royalties that come in are above poverty. So if you're not going to do that, you could self-publish it on your own, use crowdsource mechanisms, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, whatever, and you'll make so much more than you would with a publisher. So it's a great tool, and it will probably be the tool that we all have to use at some point.
I also think that you can view that stuff through the lens of distribution, and if you're interested in this stuff, I won't go too deep into this, but distribution is a huge influence on content in the history of comics, and there's some significant distribution changes, crowdfunding being one of them, that we get to experience that have come about in the last 10 or 15, 20 years. We were talking yesterday about putting your stuff on Instagram, and in some ways, like, this is what syndication would have been if you wanted to get your work in front of all of these different people. And now we have tools to do that and nobody to stop us. So, you know, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of new options through these technologies.
All right, guys, we could go like another hour, but our time is up. So everyone join me in thanking our guests.
Thanks for coming out, everybody, and thank you, Dan. This has been great.
Thank you.